Good afternoon. My name is John Matthews. I'm the Executive Director for AGWA, the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, and welcome to this session on resilient mitigation. I've been coming to World Water Week since 2008, and I can remember for several years during that period that I personally was involved in every single climate change session here. That would be impossible now. It's amazing actually to kind of think over a 10, 15-year period about the sophistication and the effervescence of climate change moving throughout the World Water Week conference, but also I think more importantly through the water community itself. And with that proliferation, I think we've seen actually a deepening in the sophistication of the issues. What we're hoping to really launch today, think of it as an invitation, is taking this two separate tracks of climate mitigation and climate adaptation and trying to bring them together in a more coherent and supportive way. Shouldn't they naturally fit together? Of course they should naturally fit together. In practice, not so much. They can actually compete with each other. They can work against each other. That's the risk. But the opportunity is really that water, and especially our dynamic adaptive management of water, can really help achieve our net zero goals. And WINZ, in that sense, Water Initiative for Net Zero, which will be introduced in just a moment, is the invitation to engage with you, the broader water community, together. We're joined in, AGWA is joined in this session in partnership and organizing this with IUCN and EMI, the International Water Management Institute, and particularly by James Dalton and Rachel McDonald, respectively. Together with myself, we serve in the steering committee for WINZ, and it's being managed by Josh Weinberg. Why don't you raise your hand? Thanks. But the insight that these two tracks needed to come together, that it's a new way to think about water management itself and how the water community can help support the larger climate community, it really comes from the next speaker. John Lane, he's the chair of the Scientific and Programming Committee. You've probably seen him dashing like a madman, very well dressed and calm madman. Across this week so far. You might also not know that he's a former Stockholm Water Prize winner himself. He's a man with a very long record of innovation and insight, and he understands both the challenges and the promise of water more broadly. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, John, for that wildly exaggerated introduction. And thank you all very much for being here. I know it's been a disrupted day and you've got a lot of other choices, so it's great that you're here with us. After 1 million years on the planet, the human species is now facing the single greatest problem that we ever have. Global heating and the climate chaos that it causes is set to fundamentally disrupt the entire planetary systems on which every species depend, including ours. The unique thing about our species is that we're the ones that caused it. And as President John F. Kennedy said, our problems are created by people, therefore they can be solved by people. So I believe that it's incumbent on every person in the world, wherever we live and in whatever walks of life, to do everything that we possibly can to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, keep down that level of global heating, and prevent the climate chaos before it gets worse. So, what are water people doing about this? I've been struck, really going back 2 years to President Biden's global climate summit soon after he became president of the United States 2 years ago. I've been struck that the global political leaders are talking almost exclusively about reducing greenhouse gases, about keeping that temperature rise down to 1.5 centigrade or whatever the figure they're looking at that moment. But they are single-mindedly focused on preventing that climate change, preventing that global heating. So I thought, hang on, what are water people talking about? Well, mostly we're all talking about adaptation. It's as if we're saying, okay, that's going to happen. The global heating is going on, the climate chaos is going, and we just need to try to respond to it. And I thought, that can't be right. Surely there must be water people that know about water's contributions to actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So I contacted a lot of people, several of whom I can see in the room, and John, of course, was one of them. And they said, oh yes, we do quite a lot of good science about this, but we are really bad at communicating it out into the political arena. So at that moment, the idea of WINZ was born. And we have formed WINZ as an overarching advocacy and communications brand, a global movement. Okay, WINZ is not an organization, it is a global movement. And what's special about what we're doing here is that we're not holding our hands out to politicians and saying, please give us money, our sector is important. Instead, it's the other way around. We're offering a gift to politicians and decision makers and indeed to the whole of humanity. And our gift is, here are some things that water people can do that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the way that we're doing that is with people like yourselves and others around the world using some great science to identify, it may be the methane coming off the anaerobic bacteria in the roots of rice paddies. It might be methane generated from human excreta, peatlands. There are lots of specific examples, and we're going to explore some of them with our panels in a minute. But the point is to take that good science, make that into really strong communication messages, and then project with one voice, so that as we offer those tools to help political leaders, anything that's coming from the water sector can be clearly identified with a brand which is trustworthy communications. And that's where WINZ Water Initiative for Net Zero comes in. And you are all part of this. You're all welcome to be a part of it. It's not formal, it's not rigid, but please, I urge all of you to keep these thoughts in your mind and do everything that you possibly can to work towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions, stabilizing the climate. I'm a grandparent. I'm sure there are other grandparents in the room, and a shiver goes down my spine to think, what world are my grandchildren and other people's grandchildren are going to be living in, at the turn of the century. So we need to act now to do everything we possibly can. You are all welcome to join WINZ. Thank you very much. You have someone over here who looks quite similar to the person who was just talking. I'm now the moderator of a panel. So let me ask these three wonderful people up onto the stage to their tables. I have Hannah O. Hannah is the International Stakeholder Engagement Lead on Water for Bayer. Please, Hannah. Alexei de Keshov is the Senior Director for Client Sustainability for Xylem. Alexei, welcome. And Dawn McGregor is the Business Engagement Lead for CWR. Big hand of applause, please, for our panel. So this panel is about the water sector and what can the water sector directly do to move itself towards net zero. And we're just going to explore 2 or 3 questions and we'll get a discussion going within the panel. My understanding is that time is fairly tight, so we're probably not going to open immediately for questions from the floor, but we will be here, we're all going to be here at the end, so please do come to interact with us, even if it may not be at this moment, because we've got 2 more panels of equally brilliant people following on. So, Hannah, please, get us started. Simple question. What are your big ideas to get the global water and sanitation sector to net zero?
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and good afternoon. So my name is Hannah, and I represent here Bayer, which is one of the largest leading healthcare as well as a food company. So being in both sector around food and health equity, it's really important for us to think about how water plays a role and how heat will play a role in terms of our human health and also into our agriculture production system. And as part of kind of the net zero commitment, in context to our scope 1, 2, 3 emission, we have made a declaration to be part of that business administration for 1.5 degrees, where for the next 10 decades, we will need to be cutting our scope 1 and 2 by almost half, and repeating that over for the next 2 more decades. And on top of that, we will be helping also our farmers to reduce their carbon footprint by about 30% by 2030. So we do have a very big role to play, given that our vision is really about how do we bring health for all and hunger for none. With that, John, to your question, what is our one big idea? And actually, that one big idea stems from one tiny little seed that you might have consumed last night. You might have had. I live in Singapore. I'm actually Korean, who is an absolute fanatics about rice, right? So you've heard in John's previous comment that there's a huge role for resilient agriculture to play, and we have targeted and selected rice as a key crop for us to actually drive the biggest impact, because we know the footprint from methane emission that rice has on a global climate crisis. About 12% of methane comes from rice alone, and on top of that, we know that around 43% of withdrawal from global irrigated water is actually being used on rice production. So this is, as much as I love the crop, I mean, we really need to tackle this, and there's about 10 countries that are producing almost 70 to 90% of rice crops. So it's a crop that we can manage pretty decently if we all have the right model of partnership, collective action. And so one of the commitments that we have launched just in March in UN Water was, how do we how do we actually make the water consumption more efficient by, for every kilogram of rice produced, to about 25%. And with that commitment, we're doing a lot of methodology development, measurement to make sure that we're really walking the talk when it comes to water efficiency. So we've targeted right now our direct seeded acres, which means we're helping farmers transition from transplanted rice into direct seeded rice, which will really uplift the intensity of water consumption, but also with the bacterial formation that causes methane emission by flooding, we're going to help actually farmers through digital innovation, mechanization, bringing in the right seed innovation that could be more resilient to salinity of water or to be more drought resistant, insect tolerant. So we're working on numerous components to really bring agronomic solutions and the right training and empowerment to farmers. So that is really our main big idea, that we are hoping to create a lot more traction. And actually for the last 2 years, we've been working on this specifically with India focus. So we just announced our Sustainable Rice Initiative together with Temasek-backed Gen Zero and Shell to really bring in more private sector, but also working with our local governments. And we'll be scaling that initiative across other Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia markets. And I think second kind of big idea is around really investment process. We have 1,000 overproduction plants across the world. And one of the commitments was really, how do we bring in the right investment processes as we look at our water treatment facilities and wastewater management. So I know there's a lot of stakeholders here that represent many of those innovative companies and ideas around circularity, waste treatment. So we would really welcome some of those connections as we think about how do we get our own production sites to be more carbon neutral. So I think those are the two main big ideas.
Yeah, super. Thanks, Hannah. And on the second point, our third panel will also be looking at that topic. But this rice thing is brilliant, right? I knew nothing about this at all until I went to the UN conference on water in New York. Hands up, who was at UN conference on water? Okay, you remember when you had to queue to get your badges, it was like 2 hours in the queue. Well, there was this person right in front of me in the queue, and I had 2 hours learning from Hannah this fantastic stuff. You flood rice paddies, they put out vast amounts of methane. You don't flood them, they don't. I mean, you know, simple and brilliant. And it's just great to hear the things that are going on with that. And my understanding is that is it's probably our number one human-generated source of methane. Number 2 being peatland, number 3 being sewage treatment. So thanks for getting us started, Hannah.
Thank you.
Alexi, please get us started on working together. How can private companies and public utilities and governments and NGOs work better together to achieve all this we're talking about with mitigation?
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for having me here. I work for Xylem, and for those who don't know Xylem, Xylem is a global solution suppliers for technologies, digital solutions, and expertise. And our 3 main segments that we serve are public utilities, industries, water users, and building services. That could be residential or commercial. And let's focus, as you mentioned, on the utility segment, because as you rightly said, it's the 3rd main contributors on emissions, mostly because of strong process gas emissions generated in biological treatment. And looking at Europe, for example, just that sector between water and wastewater treatment management systems cover up to 8% of emissions. So there is important things to do. And you ask me how can we make interactions more effective among stakeholders. My first answer, and it's not the main one, but is to generate conflicts and conversation. And the more we can face conflicts among us, because we're all water people, it's just that we have different ideas and different priorities. We need to address the conflicts so that we can find solutions to them. And I feel that everybody now is trying to avoid it slightly by looking at their agenda, their budget, their excuses for not tackling what truly matters today. An example is here. We are all aligned. That's not generating conflict. And that's a problem to me. So I'd love in the future to open this for more conflicts. Anyway, my other point is that the great thing about the race to net zero and mitigation is that we're all bound by the ankle. If one falls, we all fall. That means that if, for example, Xylem, a massive global manufacturers of equipment, pump, solutions, digital services, and so on, 95% of our emissions are where? In the use of a product our customer sites. The energy that is used by those products generate 95% of our emissions in our scope 3 category 11. That is the scope 2 of our customers. Vice versa, for customers, their scope 3 category 1 purchased goods and services is what we generate as emissions in the manufacturing and the materials of our products and services. So that is the most, let's say, favorable things for effective collaboration is these natural obligations to collaborate to get to a progress in decarbonization. So that doesn't really yet answer the question, but for me, more effective collaboration starts with building accuracy and transparency among stakeholders, and also prioritizing not necessarily towards a net zero because that might sound very overwhelming, but what is the next best emission reductions to invest in? Where can we look at? You mentioned the rice paddies, fantastic. In the water sector, in the wastewater sector, where is the next best thing to invest in? And that's the clear message or effectiveness that we can build together is on that prioritization. So collaboration, transparency, data flow, hypervisions, and commitment are key for that. Where we have seen the best success is by doing co-development. We don't have right solutions and there's not one solution fitting all. However, when stakeholders join efforts together, share their conflicts, find the solutions, and co-develop. Xylem doesn't want to pretend to have the all right solutions and technologies for everything, but we want to develop that with our customers, with governments, with the water users, so that we get faster progress. We fail, of course, everybody fails, but then we all stand up together and go to the next best solution. So that's great. I have so much more to say, but I will stop here and let you get a chance to go on. And then
You've got us started well on that topic, actually, Alexei, thanks. Terrific, we stand or fall together. I mean, this is exactly our message to all of you. You know, this is an issue that transcends the conventional boundaries between public and private sector, government and non-government, indeed, nation states. You know, nation states were invented in the 17th century. It's a concept that is struggling to cope with something that is so astonishingly big that it affects the whole planetary system. And it's important, as Alexei says, to remember that, yeah, we will stand or fall together. I have to say it's the first time I've stood on a stage and asked somebody about how we increase collaboration, and the answer came back with conflict. That was a good one. You know, we need to challenge each other. I'm sure you're right. This is a very difficult and uncomfortable subject. We know this when we see the negotiations at the high political level. It's a topic that arouses some very strong, fundamentally conflictual types of responses, and it's good that you bring that out into the open. Thanks for the start on that one. Dawn, we have a fair idea of some ways that water for net zero can have some win-wins. So, for example, look at sewage treatment plants. They consume maybe 3% of global electricity, which is more than almost any country in the world. They produce, is it 7% or 8% of human methane emissions? Well, hang on. Why don't we catch that methane to generate that power? Every sewage plant can be a power station. I mean, how cool is that? So the question for Dawn is, why haven't we done that? Well, what's wrong? What are the barriers that stop every sewage treatment plant being a power station?
Sure.
Dawn.
Thanks, John, and the panelists. I think it's been some great points. Just before I get into the barriers and to set the scene a little bit, I'd like to share our 3 ideas on how we could accelerate the transition of the water sector. Super short and sweet. 1, and it's pretty much what John said, we need to put water right next to carbon and energy in global climate discussions. And this is something the global water sector has been doing, but we have a long way to go. I mean, the UN Water Conference was just the second one. And net zero really gives us that opportunity, because we won't get to global net zero if water doesn't get to net zero. And we have to have water going forward. So this is a really strong way for us to get water right on the top of the agenda. The second point, and it's really positive to see WINZ, is there's no clear roadmap to net zero. And that's within the water sector, but also for the other stakeholders. So how are we going to add one more thing for the water for everyone to do if we don't even know, is it a priority? How do we get there? You know, what are the options? Who do we need at the table? So we need that clear roadmap, and we need it ASAP. The third one is, and I'll get to it in the barriers, one of the barriers, is to really show the business case and the investment and financial opportunities. This can attract the investors, and that will accelerate the transition. On the barrier side, I think one of the main ones is that water is misunderstood, especially outside of the sector, even within the sector a bit. And the second one is that, a little bit what I've mentioned, one of what we need to get over, is we need to decide what the water sector, what we want to do with net zero. Is it a priority? Who's going to take the lead? Is it going to be WINZ? You know, they could be a great force to get this acceleration happening. And to help overcome this, you know, we need to show that business case, that investment opportunity. And, you know, business, finance, they all love numbers. So let's look at those numbers, right? 2% of global greenhouse gases comes from water utilities. That jumps up to more than 10% if you include wastewater treatment. And everyone, I'm sure in this room knows, 80% of wastewater isn't treated at the moment. So imagine adding that in there as well. So these are sizable numbers. And in the US, 30 to 40% of a municipality's energy costs will come from water utilities and wastewater treatment. And all of this, already, you know, sizable numbers, are set to increase. The water sector's energy consumption is set to double by 2040. So this is something we need to get on top of now. So where's the opportunity? I mean, we all know it's going to take money. Everything always takes money. But UK utilities have actually set a net zero target of 2030. Whether they get there with their issues they're having at the moment, we'll see. But potentially, they've said they could save 10 million tons of global greenhouse gases by 2030. That's meaningful. And if you look into China, just in 2020, 40 million tons of CO2 equivalent was used to supply water. 40 million tons. And if you look at this globally, these are big opportunities. These are opportunities that green finance, blue finance are looking for. And so this is what can help us fast track the net zero. These are the barriers, we can use the barriers to fast track ourselves and try and limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees.
Thanks. Lots of fantastic points there. Thank you very much, Dawn. And I'm just a couple of things I want to pick up on. One is that idea that we need some as you say, a clear roadmap to net zero. We want to connect with, for example, the Race to Zero and the other people that are doing this from other sectors, the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, all these other people, because I'm sure you're right that as we mentioned earlier about being stronger together, we're also stronger together with other colleagues as well. And my goodness, some of these numbers you're telling us about how big the water sector is, even if you just look at urban water utilities and these percentages of greenhouse gas emissions, the sector in which we work is as big as or probably bigger than flying. And yet you see how flying has become a really strong topic in people's minds and in the minds of governments around the world in terms of carbon generated from aviation. Shipping, the same thing applies. It seems highly likely to us that the numbers associated with wastewater treatment are probably larger than either flying or shipping. And so it's incumbent on us then to explain that, and as Dawn says, find some way to reach out to our other colleagues, and how exciting that is going to be when that really comes to fruition. So this is great. You've got us off to a great start, all three of you, with some wonderful points. We've hit a lot of the really big numbers and a lot of the really big topics, but there's plenty more to come in the next two panels. So let's say thanks to these three fantastic people, and we'll make way for the next panel to come onto the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. So thank you, John and John. My name is not John, but it's close. My name is Josh Weinberg, also from the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. And now we're going to begin our second panel, which is discussing ensuring water resilient mitigation across sectors. I'd like to welcome our panelists. We have Dr. James Dalton, the Director of the Global Water Program at IUCN. We have Dr. Anna Tengberg, who's a Senior Advisor at CIWI and also Adjunct Professor at Lund University for Sustainability Studies. And we have Zoe Rosenblum, who's is an expert on the Young Scientific Programming Committee here at World Water Week and a PhD candidate at Oregon State University. Well, first of all, that first panel was fantastic, and we got a lot of great inputs thinking about how we can define a roadmap and accelerate action within the water sector towards net zero emissions. Now, John Lane, you talked about WINZ and how we're not coming with a hand asking for something, but we're supplying with solutions to the net zero mission. And that's true. But we do have a small ask, actually a very big one. We have an expectation that the actions we do take towards net zero development actually are water resilient and that they don't undermine the resilience of our ecosystems. And that is another huge topic and extremely important. And if we look across the actions required to get to net zero, if we look at ecosystem-based mitigation, agriculture, which was touched upon, forestry and land use in our energy systems, a majority of these measures that we're going to take are going to depend upon or impact freshwater systems to some degree, and sometimes seriously. And over the past couple of years in particular, organizations including CIWI and IUCN have begun to raise this pressing need to understand where and how water fits within the climate mitigation plans and investments. So I'll begin with James. In your role at IUCN, you've been a key voice calling for action in this area. So to begin us off, what do you think we should prioritize if we're going to get action and investment for things that can both address the freshwater challenges but also bring mitigation outcomes?
Okay, thanks, Josh. I work for an environmental organization, so I'm going to open it up with effectively the most fundamental, simple, basic part of the planet, which is really wetlands. And when I say wetlands, I'm going to incorporate some of the ecosystems that were mentioned in the first panel. We're talking about peatlands, mangroves, seagrasses, all of these critically degraded systems that we don't really understand very well as water managers in terms of their importance from a carbon perspective. Not only that, but they're also the most degraded systems because we're losing wetlands 3 times faster than we are tropical forests. So we put the attention into forests because, one, they're important, but they're also generally have a more economic value, and they're also in supply chains. So they're very close to our economic thinking. But many of these other systems are naturally not embedded in our economic thinking, and yet they're fundamental. Peatlands, through their natural degradation every year, are equivalent to 4% of global emissions. That's the same as the airline industry and shipping combined, happening every year. And so we worry about flights, but actually one of our greatest assets is effectively being eroded and degraded in front of us. We still burn peat. Even in the European Union, we still burn peat for heating and for power. So there are some fundamental, simple things that probably need to be sorted out first, straight away, where attention and action could be done, where regulation could be improved and properly enforced, and where we could help countries who don't actually understand yet the volume of these types of systems that they have on their land, how to better manage them, and work with them, and often the people who are living on these systems, the importance of them. The second thing is that the title of this entire session is Resilient Mitigation. Resilience is about a redundancy level. It's about having options in the playbook, so to speak, about how we deal with this. So rather than putting all of our eggs into, if you like, the forest basket and assuming that forests are going to get us out of this situation from a mitigation perspective, we also have to start diversifying that in terms of a portfolio of how to invest in natural systems that will also help us produce carbon benefits, will help us store that CO2 and the other gases that we desperately need to keep in the soil, working with the natural system as it fluctuates. And I don't think enough of that is really properly thought through. Not only that, but we have certain targets around degraded lands, but land that's degraded, soil that is degraded, emits. So we're also trying to tackle working on degraded lands to improve those lands, to make them no longer degraded, but to improve soil carbon, to improve the structure of those lands, and to use them as more areas where we can gain production, so we're gaining income from them, but at the same time looking at how they are carbon stores, how they can help us in the mitigation challenge. We heard earlier on from Bayer, and there was an earlier session as well on rice, about direct seeding of rice and the benefits that can bring in terms of 30 to 40% less water use, and therefore 30-40% less emissions from the land when it's wet. So that's another sort of great solution that could be scaled out further. We have to remember, of course, in all of this that we need to make sure there is production, that there is income, that the farmers and the stakeholders are actively involved in that process. And just finally on the utilities side, the point that Dawn mentioned. So yes, the UK utilities are having a bit of a kick around right now. That's a good thing, right? Rather than money to the shareholders, let's put money into the stakeholders and those that are living in those systems that are polluted. And whether or not they'll achieve that 2030 net zero target, we'll see. But at the same time, there was also an initiative by CDP to try and make that in 2027 a global utilities compact, to get global utilities behind that target. And so these are the sort of initiatives that we want to see happening further. Those utilities will not achieve net zero by just investing in renewables and just investing in new tech. They will only achieve that if they're also investing in source water protection and the natural systems where they recover water from, where they capture it from. And that's a huge opportunity, given that there are consumers and businesses paying into that system where we could be storing carbon through already a working economic model. And so far more can be done on that. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you, James. And Zoe, James has sort of outlined how wetlands and freshwater ecosystems are critical carbon sinks. And you essentially described it somewhat as low-hanging fruits in our emissions reductions. What do you think are some of the priorities that we have for ensuring that we take needed action on theirs? Or maybe what are some of the challenges that might be a little bit less apparent?
Thanks, Josh. And thanks, James. I love hearing other people talk about wetlands because that's what I study. So wetlands play a huge role in mitigating climate change and also in helping communities adapt. They not only store carbon, but they also help absorb floodwaters and purify water. So one obvious priority would be to protect wetlands and other important ecosystems to preserve the many benefits they offer, because restored or created wetlands are not as effective as natural ones. But beyond protection, we need to understand how they'll change with climate change and look towards the future, because these changes will happen. It's not just water withdrawals or land conversion that are affecting wetlands, but also climate change itself. So high-profile cases of wetland loss, like the Mesopotamian marshes, should serve as an alarm for us to identify and think about how incredible ecosystems like those will look in the future. If you aren't familiar with the Mesopotamian marshes, I encourage you to look it up. They've been covered in the New York Times over the years and also other places. And basically, the area once known as the Fertile Crescent is drying up, and people are being forced to leave because of these changes. So this sort of ecosystem degradation can be an example of climate-induced migration. It can be an example of the consequences of unsustainable upstream water withdrawals. Or framed positively, it can highlight the importance of basin-wide water management. There are well more than 300 transboundary wetlands across the globe, meaning countries will have to work across borders to protect them and think about how they look in the future. So while our water community has focused a lot on transboundary rivers and increasingly also lakes and groundwater, wetlands and other ecosystems seem to remain underaccounted for in transboundary dynamics. So one challenge here is to identify what successful transboundary wetland and ecosystem governance looks like and identify what options we have. Finally, I think it's also crucial to mention the social aspects, because communities depend on wetlands for their livelihoods, for their physical and spiritual well-being. The answer for wetland protection can't be to separate people from wetlands, but to aim for sustainable wetland management and consider Ramsar's principle of wise use. And the social aspect may also require a transformation in our relationship with nature, away from control and consumption, and toward a more reciprocal dynamic where we care for the resources that provide for us. So we already have many of the technical and scientific tools and knowledge that we need. We have nature-based solutions, biointensive agriculture and practices that help to restore the land while producing food, strong institutions, wastewater reuse, and what we need to do is work across sectors to build capacity for local communities to adopt these practices. So efforts like the Wetland City Accreditation may demonstrate that ecosystem protection and community development are not incompatible goals, but communities rely on these ecosystems for sustainable futures.
Yeah, thank you. So we've just been really within the water box so far, and we can see how many things there are to do. And I also like how you raised the transboundary issues. You know, we can see that wetland protection and restoration is something that has obvious double benefits of buffering resilience and mitigation, but maybe going to Alexis's point, we also have to confront conflicts over the management so we get to the win-win solutions. And then Anna, maybe helping us get water outside of the chapter in the IPCC reports that's on only water. Land systems are estimated by the IPCC, or mitigation measures within land systems are estimated to provide up to 20 to 30% of the mitigation we would need to reach the Paris targets. But how do we ensure that those measures in agriculture, forestry, land use are water resilient? And if we don't, what are some of the things that might happen?
Okay, I think the good news is that most of the measures in this sector, let's call it the land sector, they can contribute both to enhancing resilience and to mitigation. So there is really a win-win solution if we implement the right measures and make agriculture more water smart through, for example, different forms of conservation agriculture involving minimum tillage, using cover crops, mulching, etc. This both contributes to enhanced infiltration of water into the soil and also recharge of groundwater in many cases, and contributes to sequestration of carbon below and above ground. So really it's a win-win situation. The problem is that, yeah, we have some problems with monitoring and data of the carbon, especially in the ground. But I think new technologies and monitoring approaches are being developed, both to involve the farmers, the land users themselves in this monitoring, so that they can contribute in the carbon market, and also remote sensing. So, but what we lack are business models that show that these practices are profitable and worth investing in. And this is something we work with at SIWI in our initiative on transforming investments in rain-fed agriculture in Africa, Tiara. It is to demonstrate both to the farmers themselves and to the private sector that it's worth investing in these measures that enhance resilience and also sequester carbon. And we have seen in some trials we've been involved in that this also increases productivity up to 8 times or something like that. So yeah, this needs to be documented, the knowledge needs to be shared also with the private sector, so we get investments in these measures that have these double benefits. Then, I mean, the land sector, it involves many different land uses. We have forestry. There, it's extremely important to plant the right type of trees in the right places, you know, with the right spacing, so that we have positive impacts on infiltration at watershed scale, and ensure infiltration, recharge of groundwater, and regulation of water flows downstream. And sometimes here, upstream communities may have to be compensated for planting these trees, and then there may be need to implement payment for ecosystem services schemes or similar measures. So I think that there are many opportunities, actually, so I want to say that. Then I think the second part of the question was what can happen if we don't ensure that the measures in this sector are water resilient. Well, if land and forest management measures are not water resilient, you know, this also affects the ability to sequester carbon in the soil, which, I mean, there are many negative feedback mechanisms. It also decreases the productivity and affects livelihoods, so we enter into some kind of negative spiral if this happens. And it influences the resilience of the entire social ecological system of people's livelihoods, but also ecosystems and biodiversity can be affected. And we can have a change of state, transition to a different type of system, where it's very difficult to go back to the original system, where biodiversity is lost, productivity is lost. Can give an example, perhaps a transition from a wooded savanna to shrubland to desert. And perhaps these are changes that we have started to see already in some parts of the world. Yeah. Loss of resilience of entire social ecological systems, and I'm particularly thinking of the Sahel in Africa, of course. And this also triggers conflicts and many other problems. But there are initiatives to try to address this, like the Great Green Wall. I just hope that they can continue their implementation. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, and there's also risks with the loss of soil moisture, that you lose the ability to sequester the carbon. So if we have drier climate changes that are not taken into account, or over abstractions of land use, maybe some of these measures that we're counting on may shift. Okay, James, I move to you. I guess in the net zero world, a big elephant is the electric one. we're not going to get to a net zero future without the clean energy transition. Quickly, we're here full of people from the water community. So those listening to this session and here at Water Week, what should they do to take action to ensure that the cleaner energy systems that we need to build are also water resilient or water positive?
Yeah, well, I think first off, from an energy perspective, we need to stop burning peatlands or using peat in our need for energy. I mean, fundamental, basic one, really. The second thing is, of course, there's a lot of discussion around hydropower and the role that that will fill going forward, and certainly it's going to have a role in terms of it being able to mobilize other renewables within the system. And there's a fleet of hydropower assets around the world, hundreds of thousands of them, which could certainly probably be used far better where they've already caused disturbance. So use the existing assets that are working well already, and where there are hydropower in the system of river systems that we have, where they're no longer needed, then those are the things that we potentially need to remove. If they're not generating electricity and they're actually causing problems. And there's a lot of good work going on around the world that is doing exactly that. In particular, many of those smaller dams that have been used for transportation in the past or logging and things like that. So that's all very positive, partly because we need to reduce emissions from any of those bodies that are still emitting any form of gases, but also using hydropower more sensibly in terms of making it work well for both energy generation, adaptation in terms of how it helps control water from a flooding and risk perspective, but also how to use it from a mitigation perspective. So what should it be investing in as a hydropower asset upstream to protect systems that both have an adaptation and mitigation opportunity, upstream forests, upstream wetlands and peatlands, etc. And how could flow be used to ensure that systems downstream that rely on a certain volume of flow are also kept alive and properly functioning, mangroves and other systems. So it means that what's been traditionally, I think, from an energy perspective, a project-based approach. It goes back very much to the World Commission on Dams recommendations from 2000, which is look at the system. And that's not easy from a commercial perspective because you look at your project. But actually what governments should probably be doing is we need to look at the system, because not only are you bringing energy to the table, but you could also be affecting the mitigation potential of the entire river basin and also affecting adaptation in a negative way, making things maladaptive. So look at it as a more systemic possibility as to how you invest. There is some interesting work by the hydropower industry looking at exactly the flux of carbon in river basins and how water flows do affect that. It's a natural system after all. So understanding then if you put something in the way of that and you affect that, how does that change the balance of carbon at the broader systemic level? And how do we deal with that? And that comes from smarter infrastructure planning, smarter energy investments. And it goes back to the fact that this all sounds great, but it's very, very difficult to do. We are in that set of multiple silos that we exist in, and getting that sort of strategic planning level working is difficult. But that's exactly, I think, what we need to do. It goes back to the point from the first panel, that we have to have these conflicting conversations to be able to identify the solutions. We can no longer just have that sort of appeasing approach and only talking to those that we like or that we've always worked with, but actually really having those hard conversations, in particular with investors who will only ever look at what's the project cost and return rather than what's the responsibility that I have and what's the opportunity I have from a carbon and mitigation adaptation perspective to invest in this system more broadly, and how that will help me as an investor, but how will that also help the country. And I think countries should be making more demands on investors to be looking at these issues, because they're missing a trick. They're missing a trick with how these things can help with NDCs from a mitigation perspective, and they're missing a trick from asking of that investment to put more funding into adaptation opportunities as well. And I think to me that's just because it goes back to the point that John raised at the beginning. We don't have enough information and we're not communicating these opportunities out in a way that would allow these conversations to properly happen. So I think that's a real opportunity for us to take forward.
Okay, thank you, James. And I think also, if I chip in on the subject of energy, I think from the water community, it's okay to have some votes for the energy systems that are going to help us save water overall, but it also means that we need to engage even more in the thirstier energy options that are in the renewable energy mix. Mm-hmm. So we might be advocating for less bioenergy overall, but it's actually our competence in water management that's going to determine the scope of bioenergy that we can have in the energy mix, and the same thing with hydropower. Mm-hmm. So that's where we need to engage most, but also maybe become proponents of those water-saving technologies that might be coming in the future. With that, sorry to take the last word, but we're out of time. I'd like to thank James, Anna, and Zoe very much for your contributions. And yeah, thank you very much. I welcome John Matthews back to the floor to begin our final panel.
Thank you. That's a powerful set of themes that we've been following, and now we're going to transition to looking at the role of finance and funding in advancing and aligning these issues. I have two speakers that will be here in person, and then there will be one that will be joining online. Online we have Dr. Amgad Ahmadi. He's the water sector lead at the Green Climate Fund. I want to say that he started maybe 2 years ago, and I think he became kind of the belle of the ball in a way, Amgad, in the water community. He has an extensive background in the MENA region. He's worked with EMI. He's a very solid water professional, and it's actually really interesting and exciting that he's moved to the GCF. And I know through extensive personal discussions and interactions that he's advancing what I think of as a quite sophisticated approach to thinking about water through GCF, which in alignment with this session is supposed to, in its very DNA, to be able to divide half of its funds for mitigation and half for adaptation. And from a water perspective, that can be like a significant challenge. We're also joined by Ms. Raisa Bakai. Am I saying that right?
Razia.
Razia, thank you, so sorry. I didn't get to meet you beforehand. She's had over 15 years of experience in development and international affairs. She's with USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and as a Foreign Service Officer, served Jordan, Senegal, and D.C. Currently, Deputy Division Chief for Economic Growth, Environment, and Agriculture in the Africa Bureau, a region with a strong interest in water. Third, we'll have Tom Piniella. He's a good personal friend and a member of the Agua board, but on the side, apparently, he works for the Asian Development Bank and has served in quite a variety of roles there. I think I met you when you were in Uzbekistan, right?
Yeah, I think possibly.
I think so. And then Afghanistan, and then back in Manila for water sector, and then East Asia, and most recently, natural capital.
Yeah.
So quite a tour in his own personal history. So I'm going to, we're today, the kind of general topic is, I like to think of often when we, especially in the area of climate finance, we often very much focus on the quantity of finance. And in a simplistic way, that's often been our scorecard for how well we're doing. How much money have we spent? But that's a pretty bad scorecard, actually. You know, if I went home to my wife and I said, look at all the money that I spent on something, she might disagree about how well I had spent it. I think probably a better way to think about climate finance is actually the quality of that finance. And that, I think, is the transition that we're moving to around water in particular. And that's the kind of general topic that I'd like for all of you to be addressing. And I'd like maybe to I'll begin with you, Razia. If you could start, and then I'll go to Tom and then Amgad, to talk a little bit about this idea, like what's happening with climate finance for mitigation at a large scale, and with context for water, and how do you see those issues shifting in your own institution, as well as maybe the other institutions that you're working with, maybe part of the international architecture or some of your clients or partners?
Thank you, everyone, for inviting me to speak today on the critical topic of mitigation, as well as unlocking finance. I want to talk briefly about USAID and our climate change strategy. which sets these ambitious targets looking at climate finance. And it also talks about mitigation, adaptation, as well as the finance portion in general. People usually think that mitigation and adaptation are mutually exclusive, but they're not. We really need to look at these elements and ensure that we look at across the board. We also need to look at how we enhance resilience, but also how it contributes to our mitigation goals. I want to touch on various portions. I want to look at the mitigation, the adaptation, and then really kind of pull out the financial resources part because they are quite different, and I want to relate it back to the water sector. USAID has quite a bit of funding already in the water and sanitation sector. And the one thing we have to do is really look at it from a program basis. In terms of mitigation, we've looked at methane catchment, sludge management, and the utilization of renewables for water pumping. Methane catchment, as mentioned before by previous colleagues, really aims to capture and utilize this methane gas relating to either landfill sites, reducing it from wastewater management, as well as also looking at the sludge management and fecal waste. Also thinking about the financial resources as well as how this can reduce the financial burden is also very important as we look into the financial sustainability of our programming. So that's one way to look at the overall portion of financing of mitigation, as well as the overall reduction in greenhouse gases. From an adaptation front, which I realize wasn't the specific question, but I do want to just touch upon this because it is really important when you look at this financial resources. It's also thinking about drip irrigation for water, but also within the agriculture resource management. We've talked about watersheds quite a bit, and we've also talked about in water scarce regions. So if you look at drip irrigation, non-revenue water, water loss in the system, this also goes hand in hand with the idea of how do we mitigate. If you can capture that water that's lost in the system, you don't have to pump as much. But you also then have this cost recovery. If you're a water utility and you can't actually capture that actual tariff, then you have loss of financial resources, which then requires stakeholders such as AFDB, USAID, any other donor and then come back in and provide more financial resources. So it's really looking at it holistically to think about, okay, we need to adapt. We're in a water scarce region. I'll give two examples where USAID's worked very heavily on non-revenue water. In Jordan, really building the capacity of water utilities, looking at smart water meters, and also in South Africa. I don't need to highlight where these are two regions where you've seen drought, extreme water scarcity. But this is an area where we need to adapt, which will also help reduce our footprint on greenhouse gases, but more importantly, unlock those financial resources. The third part that I want to touch upon is really about the idea of how do we unlock finance and financial resources. I think one of the previous speakers talked about information and how there's a lack of information. I want to capture that and just really kind of tip it on its head back to this idea of conflict. It's not the idea that we don't have the information. It's how do you digest that information? If you're an investor coming into the market, the idea is that you have to have a value. You have to have a payback. And there has to be something that actually wants the private sector or a bank to actually say, we want to invest in this. So this is where you have a donor such as USAID or GIZ or FCDO or the private sector has to come in, investment fund, and say, we're going to help you unlock that finance. Whether it be the water sector or the climate change sector, these are risky areas. In my specific area where I cover the portfolio of sub-Saharan Africa, there's high risk. So then we have to say, what's the return? We have to incentivize the investment into this sector. What does incentivize mean? We have to provide guarantees. Sometimes we have to provide grants. And we also have to de-risk it. This means that there's actually an incentive for the private sector to say, yes, we are willing to take that step to invest into this market. We are also willing to bring the private sector with us. Only then, when we have that culmination of stakeholders, do you really see the financial resources come to fruition. Lastly, I just want to conclude with, it really does also require us to shift the way we think to really look at our program holistically and then really think about how we enhance resilience and also think about mitigation within the entire process of programming. Thank you.
Great, fantastic intervention. And I think it's a nice statement that you're actually viewing mitigation from a financial process, a system a process perspective, and really trying to maybe get to some of these issues through indirect methodologies, essentially bolstering the role, the financial soundness and strength and attractiveness for additional investment to achieve resilient mitigation. Tom.
Yeah, thanks, John. Let me just talk a little bit about what ADB's experience is and has been to shed some light on possible ways forward on moving this. So obviously this is a topic that's been on our radar screen for some time, even when I was chief of water some years ago, and we came up with a screening tool for utilities on electricity use. That's obviously the easiest entry point, looking at all of the things you would look at, mechanical systems, et cetera, et cetera. That came out, and that was quite simple and straightforward. Obviously, it depends on your energy mix, and hopefully we're moving in a greener way. Now, we're about to release a brand new publication, which I actually like quite a bit, called Decarbonizing Water Sector in Asia Pacific, Best Practice Challenges, Opportunities for Practitioners. It will look at both water supply sanitation, but also water resource management, large storage, conveyance, and hydropower, but really the reservoir aspect, agriculture, and land use and forestry management. So it's a much more comprehensive document and also reflects our commitment to address climate change at every possible intervention we have at ADB. In terms of finance, we've committed to $100 billion by 2030. We can come back to that. So water supply sanitation, I think that's quite straightforward. There's a lot of discussion on that, how we can get about understanding that one. The water resource, or the water supply sanitation is straightforward. Water resources management, storage, that's a bit trickier. It depends, it's very context specific in terms of basically you're getting methane and CO2 release. But they have general parameters. IPPC does that. So, but again, it's very context specific. Agriculture, there's been a lot of talk about rice and rice production. But again, this is an area where ADB has been heavily invested with our agricultural projects and trying to do things about this. Again, the point was made, moving to SRI, or intermittent watering, is both an adaptation and a huge mitigation strength. They work hand in hand, the same with non-revenue water and both mitigation, adaptation. Another thing we're finding with agriculture is food waste is actually really increasing greenhouse gas emissions, and that's something I think we could devote a lot of time, more time to. And then land use, forestry management, deforestation, wetlands. Again, this is a huge focus for us, both from a climate perspective, but now in this new role of natural capital, very important for us, and we have a large program on that. Regional Flyway Initiative across Asia is a $3 billion program or aspiration to put wetlands in place. And James highlighted why they're so important. So along with this publication, what we're doing is having an internal program to accelerate early engagement with clients and build demand for these types of projects that foster mitigation and adaptation. We're having a water community approach to DMC, very much like WINZ, strengthening our own capacity and that of our clients about mitigation in water, mobilizing finance for water sector decarbonization. We have our own loans, but we also work with GCF. and looking at promoting technology and digitalization, which we do quite a bit in the private sector. Now, this would be combined, and this is not result in mandatory guidelines or regulations, but we do also provide detailed technical solutions and policy. We have our own technical assistance. Our projects do this. Every project we do, we have to report greenhouse gas emissions. Let me just mention a few other points that are related, not necessarily to ADB, but I think that this whole argument. So, you know, you can't manage what you can't measure. So I think baseline norms, MRV, is incredibly important to this discussion, no matter about how we're taking it forward. So this is quite straightforward, or more so in the water supply sanitation space. But in the storage, the agriculture, land use, forestry, I think we have to have a much better understanding of what the interventions are and how they result in GHG emissions. And with this better understanding, then looking at finance, one way is I'm optimistic about the development of carbon markets, and possibly this is also a financial incentive to de-risk or also reduce the cost of projects. And the other thing is we can look at regulation in those countries that can afford regulation, that certain types of facilities for water need to emit X amount of GHG per QMEC, or however you want to do it. So I see this as a future for not only water, but how the whole market is going. And I think the point that John Lane raised about working with other actors on this is incredibly important. And so we have finance for projects. I think we're getting there, and this is just part of the overall discussion we're having on finance for water. We have regulation, or at least norms, which I think are possible, that institutions like MDB or ADB can adopt. And we have best practice, putting the knowledge out there, training people. So we have a range of options to address the problem, and it depends on what type of water system you're talking about, for which is the most appropriate. Also, what type of country you're talking about, what you can do, you know, in Zambia is much different than what you can do in China. So a few last thoughts about this. One, I think WINZ is a tremendous platform for us to share these things. Two, James raised it, scale. How do we think about scale and taking this forward? Same with adaptation. And I heard something about PEZ, but nobody's talked about equity here. And I think that's a huge issue going forward. I know in the energy and the other space, ADB and others, we have a just transition program. So I think, while at the same time we have to make adaptation and mitigation work harmoniously, we also need to be sure that the impacts of doing that are fair, and you don't end up with a north-south divide, or in the south, a rich-poor divide within countries, and this equity really needs to be looked at. I'll close there. Thanks.
All fantastic points, and maybe I just want to highlight two quick issues. The first point that Tom raised in the EDB was decarbonization, which is a very general kind of high-level policy term about how we remove carbon essentially from many of our economic processes, but the ADB is talking about it actually across a whole range of programs, including natural resource management programs. It's thinking about decarbonization in a very broad, strategic way that I think is quite interesting. At the same time, it's going really deep into quite technical areas. So it was almost a kind of passing comment that Tom made about thinking about what happens with the emissions, especially methane, that's coming from behind reservoirs. And this actually came up in the previous panel as well. These are kind of specialized, very strange, often not very nice wetlands, but they can be massive sources of methane, and it requires actually a very technical engagement and reoperation with those dam operators and dam planners. to be able to minimize that. So very interesting kind of multiple levels that ADB is moving on. Amgad, floor is yours.
Thanks, John. And maybe take it from GCF perspective and maybe first reflect when I joined GCF and look at the water portfolio. At that time, we had almost like 39 water projects that being approved in the water sector. Only 2 was actually having mitigation benefits. And that was, again, one of the issues that we have identified within our water portfolio. But when we dive in deep, like why actually the mitigation was not considered, there were a number of clear issues coming very clear with the consultations with the countries and also the accredited entities. And those were, I think it's been mentioned by Tom already, it's about like how really to measure and monitor the mitigation benefits and also the costs that involve in the monitoring and measurement as well in any project cost, but also the enabling environment or the regulation framework, and also how you can look at that as a co-benefits, how you look at the benefits of the carbon market and the benefits of the mitigations. So when we took this on board, we tried to see, all right, so how we can address this, how we can really look at the link between water and carbon in the context of climate mitigation, which it's very critical, but it's also always like often overlooked as well. So as a donor or a funder or the largest multilateral climate fund under UNFCCC, serving the Paris Agreement. So we looked at, all right, how we can actually incentivize the consideration for water within mitigation actions and encourage water mitigations project as well. So we look at like a dedication criteria that can actually come with a very clear way to measure the investment and also the value of investment by looking at specific criteria that really link water and mitigation and also show the mitigation benefits. And in response to that as well, we have released the water strategy or sector guides, which is available on our website, that also define like 2 pathways for paradigm shift. One, the first pathways was actually focused on the mitigation that really define the different pathways or type of water project that really respond to mitigation. That's looking at like a smart digital water meter, the demand management, non-revenue water, the water reuse system, but also decentralized model and also the resource recovery as well. Secondly, we also look at how we can actually look at the integrated approach or promote the integrated approach. And this by looking in a way to incorporate the water management strategies into the carbon mitigations effort and see how that can be a structure in the project. So for every project that we receive, that mostly coming as adaptation projects, we try to look at the cross-cutting or the potential of mitigations benefits. And we try to, again, having a discussion with the countries, with the accredited entity to try to define that mitigation. And we realize this as a core benefit for the project. And also in a way, we look at the investment value adds and also the return on investment. But also we looked at like how we can also help that by look at an innovative finance or a flexible financial an instrument using the scale of constitutionality for GCF that can actually be provided, and also as we are a risk taker in terms of water investment projects. So we have established that water as a new asset class, and very clear treating water as a new asset class for wastewater or sanitation or even desalination projects with a very clear link with acceptable revenue streams that really link to like to the mitigation benefits, but also to the carbon market as well. And this, again, it's another way to again, to motivate the carbon market as well, and see how this can become as a benefits to mobilize the private sector, because we understand we can't actually continue rely on the public finance or development finance, and that will never take us to meet the SDGs. So we really need to mobilize the private sector, and to be able to mobilize the private sector, we really need to show like the different revenue streams that can actually come as a return on investment, and show them. And we encourage this by our de-risk or the incentive that we provide in terms of constitutionality. But also, when we do that, we also realize again the challenge in terms of developing the project. So we actually came with the idea of the co-investment platform that actually allowing us as GCF to provide the technical assistance that actually taking all the costs or the upfront cost of project design. And to inform this as well, we have released the water project design guidelines that's available on our website. It's a very structured framework that actually take you in a stepwise approach, how you actually design your water project to meet climate finance for adaptation and mitigations, with example for climate resilience WASH, for integrated water source management, for the basin scale that James was talking about as well. So there is a very clear example how you can actually apply that guidelines. But also, as I mentioned, like we come very clear with the co-benefit recognitions for the mitigations by highlight that co-benefits of integrated water consideration into mitigation actions. And that was coming as one of the criteria when we assess the project or the proposal. We look at that again as one of the key criteria, but also realize this in a way we assess our investment as well. But also, like just to finish on the points, it's also look at the safeguard mechanism and the engagement with the local communities, and how that can be, again, structured within the project by itself, but also in the project monitoring, and how you look at in each project about a component that actually look at the enabling environment, but also empowering community with the tool, with the techniques to be able to measure the co-benefits of the mitigation as well. And that was, again, a good example in one of our projects that have been approved for Barbados for water reuse with mitigation benefits as well from wastewater reuse. So I don't want to take most of the time on this, but I think there is a way we can actually look at the interconnectivity between water and carbon within climate mitigation, and this by looking at the holistic and strategic approach. And I think if we, like all other funders, adopting those different type of strategies, like from technical assistance to taking water as an asset class with the link with the carbon market and acceptable revenue streams, with the technical assistance that can be provided and take the upfront cost to de-risk that investment. I think we can pave the way really for more sustainable resilience future, and also establish that knowledge about the connections between water and carbon. Thanks.
This is really interesting, Amgad. One of the kind of founding ideas behind the GCF is an old climate policy term, additionality. The idea that our climate finance needs to do something new and additional beyond traditional development. And I see that's often been a source of sensitivity in the water community over the long period. But what I hear you saying, Amgad, is actually that it might be a kind of hidden superpower for seeking synergies between mitigation and adaptation. And your things come to the GCF as at a project scale, which is often quite different than you see with USAID or with the ADB, that there's a project that is proposed from a middle or lower income country, and you're seeking a way to pump it up actually to use that, to amplify that additionality that we've seen as a weakness and actually make it into a real strength. And if it comes as an adaptation project, to bring in the mitigation. If it comes as a mitigation project, to bring in the adaptation. And really view water in a much more synergistic way. That's very interesting. And I think we're pretty short on time, and I think I need to hand it off. But if you could give the panel a very warm round of applause. Thank you. Rachel, yes, please. Rachel is the Deputy Director General for the International Water Management Institute and also a close friend and global collaborator. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you to the panelists. Haven't we been inspired so far? Now, I have the unenviable task of trying to summarize and look at what we have been talking about over this last hour and 20 minutes. So where are we starting from? WINZ is a platform. It is exactly what John Lane said. We're trying to mobilize and inspire and bring solutions to water as part of mitigation. So much of, as Amgad was saying, so many of those projects go into GCF, but we could see that that's just a microcosm of what the situation is. Water has not necessarily been seen as a major driver to bringing mitigation. And yet we can see from the examples we've been given, water systems do contribute. So what we've heard is that the actual water systems, the processes, the pumping of the water, everything like that, it brings increased energy use, so increases the greenhouse gas emissions. But we also hear that as part of those processes, greenhouse gas emissions are taking place. The methane being released from our irrigation or from our wastewater thing, we are contributing to that. We're also hearing, as part of the work that we can do, as developments take place on our forestry or our wetlands or in our agriculture, we are increasing not only emissions, we're reducing our ability to sequester carbon. So we have these three main areas that we can look at and really bring those changes. And we heard today the various solutions that came through. Now I have to reach for my glasses to be able to read what I've written. So Hannah, to begin with, was just telling us about some of the big ideas that they're bringing. Yes, rice, it's one area that's being considered in many different scales, but what a contribution if we can bring that change. So working across the water and food sectors, let's mobilize that. But also investment. You talked about the investment process in water and wastewater processes. How can we mobilize the investment that not only brings new water systems, but as those systems are being designed, we can bring mitigation thinking into it. We hear so much about circular economy, and Amgad talked about reuse and resource recovery. When is it when ADB maybe when you are financing a wastewater system? What will be great is, as you're doing it, is how can we then capture the biogas? How can we bring circularity into that early stage design? And can we retrofit wastewater systems to take that on board? Alexis, thank you for bringing up conflict. Yes, some of the best conversations and some of the best dialogues are when you're talking to somebody who disagrees with you. That's when we can get to a better level. So let's bring those conflicts together. And it's not just about water and water productivity and water, how many customers we're going to serve. It's all about how can we bring that mitigation, bring that into that engineering design and many others. They're bringing that conflicting conversations together. Dawn, you told us about the work you're doing on sewage treatment plants and how we can look at that power sector, water beside climate energy, and this not net zero. I mean, yes, absolutely, we need to be aiming at net zero, but what's the best one we can bring in? It mightn't get us as net zero at the moment, but at least bring in this staged movement towards net zero. Let's not be overwhelmed by the thought that it's got to be net zero right from the beginning, and we do have to have a clear roadmap. How many of our countries that we work with and work in, or even in our institutions, has a clear roadmap of how we're going to bring adaptation? We talk about water resilience, water, climate resilience, but how much of that is adaptation really, and how much of it is not bringing those mitigation solutions we were hearing about. And yes, the business case. Every aspect of water systems or of agricultural systems or nature-based systems, we need to bring finance to be able to make the things happen. And the more we can show that there is a business case to that, that's important. When we looked at the barriers, we can see that finance and fast tracking is that. We then looked at what is it we can do across the sectors. We've looked at the water sector, and there's many challenges. So we had a particularly really good set of ideas from the ecosystems and environmental sectors. Look at peatlands and mangroves. Let's think beyond just those wetlands in the way they're doing. And what can we do to leverage finance to be able to support them? So not only are we increasing biodiversity, but we can bring that mitigation. We can bring those water offset benefits from those systems. So let's keep thinking about how we bring that in. Where are the targets? When we hear about land restoration, we hear from the CBD that the Convention on Biological Diversity, let's bring some greenhouse gas emission targets as we're looking at those investments as we're doing there. And James, you talked about hydropower. This is always seen to be managing those hydropower systems. Water is often part of green energy. One of the things we haven't really talked about in this session is water systems as part of the energy transition. So we always have hydroelectric power. But this green hydrogen, the green hydrogen, it starts with good quality water. Well, where are we going to get that from? So we know that there's conflict between energy transitions and food transitions and the water transition, which we really don't think about. And we need to bring that greenhouse gas lens to that. Anna, you spoke about the various mitigation in land systems, agriculture, AFULO, agriculture, forestries and land use, 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. And so many of the solutions and some of the work that goes with that involves water. So what can we do? Yes, conservation, tillage, so many of these ideas we all learned about as undergraduates. Why haven't they taken place? Why haven't we been able to bring regenerative agriculture, reduce evapotranspiration, bring better water management into those systems? And we have to get into bed with agriculture a lot more closely. And it was really good yesterday in the COP28 internal conversation. There is a massive push at COP28 to have water and food systems coming out with trying to move towards a joint declaration, but bringing just at this one COP, food and water together to bring what we need to do, whether it's emissions or adaptation, but particularly in this mitigation that we can do. Forestry has a very important path to play in that. And Zoe, I loved all your work on wetlands. What an inspiration, and we need evidence and the type of input that you can bring from research to be able to then make the business case that we've heard so many times. Give us the numbers, give us what we can do for this amount of dollars. What are we able to do? And yes, some of it is about dollars we spend, but it is about the emissions that we've saved beside it, and we need to do. And then when we looked at the investments, my goodness, this is terribly important. Razia, climate finance, and this notion of donors coming in to be the ones that can inspire. We hear about blended finance. I was listening yesterday about stacked finance. So we're stacking up the finance, and donors such as USAID, they can sometimes be the donor of first loss. So they're willing to put their money in. They may be 10% or 20%, but it offsets the risk, because we know that if there is a challenge to that, they're the ones who are willing to lose their money first. So that's how we bring the private sector investors into this, and we can bring across that. And we talked about catchments and investing above stream and downstream of our water system to be able to look at that. And wonderful, the Jordan and South Africa water meters. People don't realize how much they're using. And every meter cube we use, there is an energy cost to that. And not only are we saving water, we can save the energy involved with the pumping of that work. Tom, ADB is always out there thinking forward. And I do like this notion of this decarbonising. We all want to get hold of that report. And how great that you're putting CO2 into your reporting across all projects. I know the World Bank also has, when they're being assessed, they can do that. So a really important role that these multilateral finance institutions can bring into the work there. Amgard, you mentioned about carbon markets and regulations and best practices and what we can do in these areas, about that water portfolio. And we are probably 1 minute over. I'm going to be very quick here. We can see that there's the types of projects you are now funding. Thank you, Green Climate Fund, for inspiring and showing that water can be part of the mitigation, can be part of that. If we can bring mitigation into our adaptation or the other way around, we can start hitting those 2% or the 12% or those numbers that we've been talking about throughout all of this. So we've had great solutions today. What we want is for you to join WINZ. We've heard from AGWA, from IUCN, and from IMI. We bring different, some really interesting solutions, but you have many more. We are a platform. The idea is we want to take your solutions. We want to put those solutions into easy, communicable forms so they can be taken up by any government or investor or community group that really wants to bring a change. So please talk to us. Please join us. We are a very open organization, and we do also have some fun along the way as well. So thank you very much for your time. We've really appreciated that you came to this session, which means you're committed, you want to join the commitment to water as being part of mitigation systems. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of Stockholm Water Week. Thank you.